Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Ball and Story. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you doze off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. In this new story, they found a cabin deep in West Virginia. They shouldn't have gone inside. The dense thickets of the Cranberry Wilderness in West Virginia have a reputation for being one of the most rugged and unforgiving landscapes in the eastern United States. In late August of 1994, a group of 5 seasoned hikers entered the Monongahela National Forest with the intention of completing a standard 48-mile loop through the backcountry. They were well equipped with topographical maps, compasses, and enough supplies to last for a full week, even though their itinerary only called for 4 days of travel. The terrain in this specific region is characterized by high-altitude bogs, ancient spruce forests, and a canopy so thick that sunlight often struggles to reach the forest floor. By the second morning of their trek, the group reported a subtle but pervasive shift in the atmosphere that none of them could immediately identify. The standard sounds of the Appalachian morning, such as the calls of chickadees and the rustle of small mammals, had completely vanished, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and pressurized against their eardrums. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the hikers noted that the air seemed to take on a metallic quality, leaving a sharp taste on the back of their tongues. They initially attributed this to the high iron content in the local soil, or perhaps a shift in barometric pressure, but the sensation was accompanied by a persistent low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the soles of their boots. One member of the party, a former surveyor, checked his magnetic compass and found that the needle was no longer fixed on north, but was instead drifting slowly in a clockwise circle. He assumed the device had been damaged or was being affected by a localized mineral deposit, but when he checked the backup compasses carried by the rest of the group, every single one displayed the same erratic behavior. They decided to pause their progress and consult their paper maps, only to find that the landmarks they had passed just an hour prior did not correlate with the topography surrounding them. The group attempted to backtrack to their previous night's campsite, following the trail they had clearly carved through the underbrush. Within 20 minutes, they found that the path had seemingly been reclaimed by the forest. The broken branches and boot prints they expected to see were gone, replaced by a wall of rhododendrons that appeared undisturbed by human passage for decades. The lead hiker later described the sensation as if the forest was actively rearranging itself behind them. They spent the next several hours attempting to find a recognizable ridge or stream, but the landscape had become a repetitive loop of gray trunks and moss-covered stones. The sun, which should have been high in the southern sky by midday, appeared as a pale, blurred disk that seemed to stay stationary on the horizon for hours at a time, making it impossible to judge the passage of time without looking at their watches. By what their watches indicated was 5 o'clock in the evening, the hikers decided to set up an emergency camp in a small clearing. The silence in the woods had grown even more profound, to the point where they could hear the sound of their own heartbeats and the internal rush of blood in their ears. They attempted to start a campfire using dry wood they had collected, but the flames behaved unnaturally. Instead of the typical orange and yellow flickers, the fire burned with a cold, pale violet hue and produced no heat that could be felt more than a few inches away. One witness reported that the smoke didn't rise into the air, but instead pooled on the ground like a heavy liquid flowing into the depressions in the dirt. They sat in a tight circle, avoiding the darkness beyond the clearing, where they felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched by something that lacked a physical form. During the night, the hikers experienced what they described as shared auditory distortions. They heard the sound of a human voice calling out from the deep woods, mimicking the voice of one of their own group members who was sitting right next to them. The voice didn't sound like a recording or a ghost, but like an imperfect imitation produced by something that didn't understand human language. It repeated short phrases and names with a mechanical, grinding cadence that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves rather than a specific location in the brush. None of them answered the calls, recalling local folklore about the dangers of acknowledging unknown sounds in the Appalachian backcountry. The air temperature around their camp dropped to near freezing levels, despite the regional weather reports for that week predicting overnight lows in the mid-60s. When the sun finally rose on the third day, the clearing they were in looked different than it had the night before. The trees were taller, their bark a shade of ash gray that none of the hikers recognized as being native to West Virginia. They found that their watches had stopped at the exact same moment during the night, yet the mechanical components inside appeared to be functioning perfectly. They began to walk in the direction they believed led toward the Highland Scenic Highway, but they soon encountered a geological anomaly that wasn't on any map. A small creek was flowing up a steep incline, the water moving with a viscous, slow-motion quality against the laws of gravity. The group stood and watched the water for a long time, their sense of reality beginning to fracture under the weight of what they were perceiving. They felt a profound sense of lightheadedness and nausea, which they later interpreted as a physical reaction to a space that no longer adhered to standard physical laws. The escalation of events reached a peak when they stumbled upon a structure in a valley that should have been uninhabited. It was a cabin built of logs that appeared to be made of stone rather than wood, with no doors or windows and a roof that slanted at an impossible angle. The air surrounding the building was filled with a static charge that made their hair stand on end and caused sparks to jump between their fingertips whenever they touched their gear. One hiker claimed to see silhouettes moving inside the solid walls of the cabin, described as shadows that were darker than the ambient light of the forest. They didn't approach the structure, instead choosing to run in the opposite direction until their lungs burned. They reported that as they ran, the forest behind them seemed to stretch and elongate, making the distance they covered feel like miles, even though they were only moving for a few minutes. The group's perception of time continued to disintegrate throughout what they believed was their fourth day. They experienced periods where the forest would suddenly go dark as if it were midnight, only for the sun to reappear in a different part of the sky seconds later. They became convinced that they were no longer in the state of West Virginia, or perhaps no longer in the same year they had started their hike. Their memories of their lives before the trip began to feel distant and fragmented, like stories they had read in a book rather than personal experiences. They stopped eating, not because they lacked food, but because the very idea of nourishment felt irrelevant in an environment that seemed to be fueled by something other than biological energy. They continued to move blindly through the woods, driven only by a primal instinct to escape the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. On what they perceived to be the evening of the fourth day, they suddenly crested a ridge and saw the asphalt of a mountain road in the distance. The transition was described as being as sharp as a camera cut in a movie. One moment, they were surrounded by the gray, silent trees and the uphill flowing water, and the next, they were standing in a recognizable forest of oak and maple with the sound of insects buzzing in the heat. They scrambled down to the road and were eventually picked up by a passing motorist. When they were brought to a local ranger station, they were shocked to learn that the date was September 5th. According to the calendar, they had been missing for over 2 weeks, yet they only had memories of 4 days of travel. Their bodies were emaciated and covered in strange geometric bruises, but they had no recollection of how those injuries had been sustained. The aftermath of the incident was marked by a series of failed attempts by local authorities to find the locations described by the hikers. Search and rescue teams combed the area where the group had emerged, but they found no stone cabins, no gray forests, and no evidence of the geological anomalies the witnesses insisted were real. Professional surveyors took equipment into the cranberry wilderness and found no magnetic disturbances or unusual mineral deposits that could account for the compass failures. The official report concluded that the group had suffered from a localized occurrence of mass hysteria, likely triggered by an accidental ingestion of toxic fungi or exposure to an unidentified environmental contaminant. The missing time was dismissed as a symptom of the same psychological breakdown, with the suggestion that the hikers had simply been wandering in a daze for the days they could not account for. The hikers themselves never accepted the official explanation. They remained adamant that their experiences were physical realities, not hallucinations. In the years following the event, several members of the group sought out specialists in physics and neurology to try and understand what had happened to them. One theory presented was that they had inadvertently entered a localized temporal rift or a pocket of space where the laws of physics were temporarily suspended, perhaps due to the unique geological composition of the Appalachian Range. Another interpretation suggested that the forest itself possesses a form of sentience or a defense mechanism that it occasionally deploys against intruders who venture too far into its core. None of these theories could be proven, leaving the witnesses in a state of permanent uncertainty regarding the most traumatic event of their lives. The lasting impact on the survivors was profound and varied. Two of the hikers refused to ever enter a wooded area again, eventually moving to urban environments in the Midwest where the horizon was flat and predictable. One member of the group became obsessed with the history of the Monongahela National Forest, spending his life savings on archived newspapers and regional folklore in a desperate search for similar accounts. He discovered dozens of reports from the 19th century involving hunters and loggers who had returned from the woods with identical stories of stone houses, whispering trees, and days that vanished in an instant. These historical records suggested that the 1994 incident was not an isolated event, but part of a recurring phenomenon that has haunted the region for as long as people have attempted to map it. The physical evidence of the event remained limited to the strange bruises on the hiker's skin and the state of their equipment. When the compasses were later tested in a laboratory setting, they functioned perfectly, as did the watches that had supposedly stopped in the wilderness. The geometric bruises took months to fade and did not follow the patterns of typical blunt force trauma or skin infections. Medical professionals were unable to provide a definitive cause for the markings, and some researchers speculated they were the result of exposure to high-intensity electromagnetic fields or some form of non-ionizing radiation. This added another layer of mystery to the case, as there were no known sources of such energy in the remote backcountry of West Virginia during that time period. In the local communities surrounding the Cranberry Wilderness, the story of the 1994 hikers has passed into the realm of modern legend. Older residents often speak of the mountains as having a mind of their own, warning younger generations about the places where the shadows don't move with the sun. They refer to these areas as thin spots, where the world we know is stretched thin over something else entirely. While modern technology like GPS and satellite mapping has made the wilderness feel smaller and more accessible, those who live near the forest know that there are still parts of the ridge that the satellites don't seem to see correctly. They believe that the hikers were simply the latest in a long line of people who were allowed to return from a place that usually doesn't let go. The unresolved tension of the incident lies in the fact that it could happen again at any time. There is no warning sign for a temporal rift or a shifting forest, and no way to prepare for an environment that rejects the fundamental rules of existence. The 1994 hikers were experienced, prepared, and rational, yet they were completely helpless against the phenomena they encountered. Their story serves as a reminder that despite our maps and our science, the natural world still contains pockets of the unknown that are indifferent to human understanding. The Cranberry Wilderness remains a popular destination for hikers and campers, most of whom return with nothing more than photos of the scenery and a few sore muscles, but the silence still waits in the deeper valleys for the next person to lose their way. Researchers who study the phenomenon of missing time often point to the Appalachian Mountains as a hotspot for such reports. The sheer age of the mountains, which were once as tall as the Himalayas before millions of years of erosion wore them down, is often cited as a reason for their perceived strangeness. Some believe that the mountains have developed a kind of geological memory, or that they are so ancient they have become a repository for energies that have long since faded from the rest of the planet. Whatever the cause, the accounts of those who have been caught in the forest's grasp are remarkably consistent across decades and centuries, pointing toward a reality that is far more complex than a simple psychological explanation would allow. The 1994 case is particularly significant because of the number of witnesses involved. While individual accounts of paranormal encounters are easily dismissed, a group of 5 adults with no history of mental illness or drug use providing a synchronized testimony is much harder to ignore. They didn't just see something in the distance, they lived inside a distorted reality for what turned out to be 2 weeks of their lives. Their shared experience of the violet fire, the stone cabin, and the uphill creek creates a cohesive narrative that suggests a physical event rather than a collective dream. The fact that they all returned with the same physical symptoms and the same gaps in their memory adds a weight of evidence that continues to challenge the skeptical interpretations of the incident. Today, if you visit the Monongahela National Forest, you can find the trailhead where the group first entered the woods. The signs are clear, the paths are well maintained, and the forest looks exactly as it should. But for those who know the history of the 1994 disappearance, the beauty of the landscape is overshadowed by the knowledge of what happened just a few miles into the brush. They know that the silence of the woods can be a precursor to something much more disturbing than just a lack of noise. They understand that the mountains don't necessarily need to be haunted by ghosts to be terrifying, and that the most frightening thing in the world is finding yourself in a place where your own senses can no longer be trusted. The survivors of the 1994 trek eventually stopped giving interviews, finding that the more they talked about their experience, the more it seemed to alienate them from the rest of society. The skepticism they faced from authorities and the public was a secondary trauma that made it difficult for them to integrate their memories into their daily lives. They carry the secret of those 8 missing days with them, a private burden that only the 5 of them can truly understand. They are living proof that the world is not always as solid or as logical as we like to believe, and that sometimes the only thing you can do when the woods go quiet is to keep walking and hope that you eventually find a road that leads back to the world you know. The mystery of the stone cabin and the gray trees remains one of the most compelling aspects of the West Virginia archives. To this day, hikers occasionally report finding strange structures in the Cranberry Wilderness that don't match any known architecture, only for those structures to be gone when they return with others. These sightings are often accompanied by the same sense of dread and the same failures of electronic equipment that the 1994 group experienced. It suggests that the phenomenon is not a one-time event, but a permanent feature of the landscape, a localized glitch that appears and disappears according to a logic that remains entirely hidden from us. The mountains keep their secrets, and they do not offer explanations to those who are lucky enough to escape their influence. Geologists have noted that the area of the Cranberry Wilderness sits on a complex series of ancient fault lines and limestone caverns, many of which have never been fully mapped or explored. Some have suggested that these underground systems could trap pockets of gas or create unique acoustic environments that might contribute to the sensations reported by the hikers. However, this doesn't account for the visual and temporal aspects of the case, which seem to go far beyond what could be caused by gas inhalation or strange echoes. The physical reality of the hiker's experience, backed by their emaciated state and the geometric bruises, points towards something much more substantial than an environmental trick. The legacy of the incident is a quiet one. whispered in the back rooms of ranger stations and around the campfires of local hunters who have seen things they can't explain. It serves as a modern folktale that reinforces the traditional wisdom of the Appalachian people. The mountains are older than we are, and they have rules that we are not meant to understand. The hikers who went into the woods that August were looking for a simple escape from their lives, but they found themselves in the middle of a reality that was indifferent to their plans and their survival. They were witnesses to a side of the natural world that few ever see and even fewer survive to talk about. As the decades pass, the 1994 disappearance remains a standout case in the annals of American unexplained phenomena. It lacks the melodrama of a ghost story or the clear-cut narrative of a crime, offering instead a cold and clinical look at the breakdown of physical reality. It challenges the listener to consider what they would do if their compass failed, their path vanished, and the sun refused to move in the sky. It is a story about the fragility of our perception and the vast, silent power of the wilderness to reshape the world in its own image. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand as they have for millions of years, vast and beautiful, and occasionally, completely and utterly impossible. The 5 hikers who emerged from the woods that September morning are now older, their lives having taken them in different directions, but they are forever linked by those 4 days that were actually 14. They are the only people who know what the violet fire felt like or what the voices in the trees were trying to say. They are the ones who saw the water flow uphill and felt the weight of a stone cabin that wasn't there. Their experience remains a haunting reminder that there are still places on this earth that have not been tamed, and that some of the most profound mysteries are not found in space or in deep oceans, but in the familiar green ridges of our own backyard. The final notes in the regional archives regarding the 1994 case focus on the inability to find any rational cause for the event. The case remains classified as an unexplained occurrence, a bureaucratic term that does little to convey the sheer terror of the experience. The forest hasn't changed, and the trails are still there, waiting for the next group of people who think they know what to expect when they step into the trees. The story of the Cranberry Wilderness is a cautionary tale about the limits of human knowledge and the enduring power of the unknown. If you ever find yourself in the deep woods of West Virginia and the birds go silent, remember the hikers of 1994 and hope that your compass still points north. The geometric bruises found on the hikers were photographed and analyzed by a forensic dermatologist who noted that the patterns were incredibly precise, consisting of interlocking hexagons that appeared to be scorched into the skin at a microscopic level. There was no evidence of heat damage to the surrounding tissue, and the markings did not follow the path of any known nerve or blood vessel. This detail, more than any other, suggested that the hikers had been subjected to some kind of external force that operated on a level of precision that is not found in nature. The source of this force remains a mystery, as does the reason why it would leave such specific marks on its victims. Another curious detail that emerged years later was the discovery of a rusted hiker's canteen found in a section of the forest where the group claimed to have seen the stone cabin. The canteen was of a design that had not been manufactured since the 1950s, yet it was found on top of a pile of fresh leaves as if it had just been placed there. When researchers opened it, they found it was filled with a thick, violet-colored liquid that matched the color of the fire the 1994 hikers had described. The liquid was never officially analyzed, as it allegedly evaporated within minutes of being exposed to the air, leaving behind only a faint smell of ozone and wet stone. This discovery added another layer to the theory that the forest is a place where different eras of time occasionally collide. The 1994 group's lead hiker, before he stopped giving interviews, often remarked on the peculiar way the silence in the woods felt like a physical weight. He described it not as the absence of sound, but as the presence of something that was actively suppressing sound. He felt that if he had shouted at the top of his lungs, the noise would have traveled no further than his own lips. This acoustic suppression is a common feature in many of the most disturbing reports from the Appalachian backcountry, suggesting that whatever phenomenon causes these spatial and temporal distortions also has a profound effect on how sound waves move through the air. It is a terrifying prospect for anyone who might need to call for help in an emergency. The psychological toll on the witnesses also included a recurring dream that several members of the group reported having for years after the event. They dreamed they were still in the gray forest, but instead of trying to leave, they were standing perfectly still, becoming part of the landscape themselves. They felt their skin turning to the same ash-gray bark and their blood becoming the same viscous, uphill flowing water. This sense of being assimilated by the environment is a common theme in the folklore of the region, where the mountains are often described as wanting to keep those who enter them. The hikers' struggle to remain human in a place that seemed to reject their presence was as much a psychological battle as a physical one. The official search records show that during the 8 days, the group was truly missing, but unaccounted for in their own memories. There were several unconfirmed sightings of them by other hikers in the forest. These witnesses described the group as moving in a single-file line with a mechanical, rhythmic pace, ignoring any attempts to get their attention. They appeared to be looking straight ahead with blank expressions, their clothing looking pristine despite the rugged conditions. These reports were dismissed at the time as sightings of other hiking parties, but when compared with the 1,994 group's timeline, they suggest that the hikers were physically present in the forest, even when their consciousness was somewhere else entirely. In the end, the story of the Cranberry Wilderness disappearance is a puzzle with too many pieces and no clear picture. It sits at the intersection of geology, physics, and folklore, providing just enough evidence to be disturbing, but not enough to be solved. It is a reminder that the world we live in is a thin layer of the known, stretched over a vast and ancient unknown. For the 5 hikers who walked into the Monongahela National Forest in 1994, that layer briefly tore open and they were forced to see what lay beneath. They returned to a world that didn't believe them, carrying the weight of a truth that they can never fully explain. The woods of West Virginia continue to grow, the trees drawing nutrients from the soil and reaching for the sun. The trails remain open, inviting the curious and the brave to explore the beauty of the Appalachian Range. But somewhere in the heart of the wilderness, there is a clearing where the fire burns violet and the water flows uphill. There is a stone cabin with no doors and a forest of gray trees that doesn't know the name of the year. The mountains are still there, and they are still not letting anyone leave who doesn't know the way back. The silence is the only answer they offer, and for some, that silence is the most terrifying sound in the world. In this news story, they heard a woman crying in the woods, but no one was there. The rugged stretch of the White Pass and Yukon route, winding through the boundary between Alaska and British Columbia, remains one of the most geographically isolated corridors in North America. In the late spring of 1974, a maintenance crew tasked with clearing winter debris from a remote section of the tracks reported a series of auditory experiences that did not align with the known wildlife or environmental acoustics of the region. The men were working near a steep embankment known for its treacherous footing and frequent rock slides when they heard the distinct sound of a woman crying. The sound was described in subsequent logs as being close enough to suggest someone was standing just beyond the immediate tree line. Yet, the surrounding terrain consisted of near-vertical cliffs and dense, impenetrable brush. There were no missing persons reports in the area at the time, and the nearest settlement was several hours away by rail, making the presence of a lone woman in that specific location highly improbable. The crew initially assumed that the sound was a trick of the wind or perhaps a juvenile animal in distress, but the vocalization was remarkably articulate and human. It wasn't a scream or a shout for help, but a rhythmic, grieving sob that seemed to move along the ridge parallel to the workers. As they attempted to locate the source, the sound would abruptly stop in one location, only to resume several hundred yards away in a spot that no human could have reached in such a short interval. The lead foreman, who had worked the line for over 20 years, noted that the air in the vicinity of the sound felt unusually cold, even for the high-altitude environment of the pass. He reported a sensation of intense pressure in his ears, similar to a rapid change in altitude, which made the sobbing sound feel as though it was vibrating inside his own head rather than traveling through the air. The following day, the crew returned to the same site with additional equipment, accompanied by a local guide who was familiar with the various acoustic anomalies of the mountain range. Within an hour of beginning their work, the crying returned, this time accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel ballast of the tracks. The guide noted that while the footsteps were clearly audible to everyone present, there were no corresponding indentations in the loose stone and no displacement of the silt along the rail bed. The men stopped their machinery to listen, and the crying intensified, shifting from a sob to a low, melodic humming that seemed to resonate from the metal of the tracks themselves. The guide advised the crew to move further down the line, expressing a belief held by some locals that certain areas of the pass acted as a recording of past events, though he couldn't offer a rational explanation for why the sound seemed to react to their presence. By the third day of the maintenance project, the psychological strain on the workers was becoming evident in the daily shift reports. Several men claimed they could hear their own names being whispered in the gaps between the woman's sobs. One worker reported seeing a pale, indistinct shape moving through the trees at the edge of his vision, describing it not as a person but as a distortion in the light, similar to heat haze on a summer road. When he turned to look directly at the area, the shape would vanish, leaving behind a smell that he described as ozone and wet earth. The crew's communication radios began to malfunction during these episodes, emitting a steady stream of static that occasionally broke into fragmented, unintelligible speech in a language none of the men recognized. The technicians who later inspected the radios found no mechanical defects, noting that the interference seemed to be localized to a specific 300-yard stretch of the pass. The escalation of the incident occurred when the crew's dog, a large Malamute used to warn of bears, refused to leave the maintenance car and spent the afternoon whimpering in a corner. The animal's behavior was cited by the crew as the most disturbing element of the week, as the dog was a veteran of the backcountry and had never shown fear toward wolves or grizzlies. At the same time, the dog began to cower. The crying sound moved directly onto the tracks, positioned between the workers and their transport vehicle. The men described a sudden loss of color in the environment, with the vibrant greens of the spring foliage turning a dull, ashen gray. They felt a profound sense of grief that they couldn't explain, an emotional weight that made it difficult for them to continue their work or even speak to one another. The foreman made the executive decision to pull the crew from the site early, citing unsafe working conditions and equipment failure. The railway company conducted a brief internal investigation into the reports, sending a supervisor to the location to verify the crew's claims. While the supervisor did not hear the crying during his 4-hour stay, he did report a series of magnetic anomalies that caused his handheld compass to spin erratically. He also noted that the temperature in that specific section of the pass was consistently 12 degrees lower than the areas immediately surrounding it. He found a series of strange markings on the wooden rail ties, described as scorched geometric patterns that didn't resemble any known maintenance codes or vandalism. The supervisor concluded that while he couldn't confirm the presence of a person or an entity, the area was experiencing some form of atmospheric or geological disturbance that was affecting the crew's perception and equipment. Local records from the early 20th century were later uncovered that mentioned similar experiences in the same section of the White Pass. During the construction of the railway in the late 1890s, laborers frequently complained of hearing a woman's voice near the Dead Horse Trail, a notoriously lethal path used during the Klondike Gold Rush. The accounts from 1898 describe the same rhythmic sobbing and the same sense of misplaced grief. These historical reports often attributed the sounds to the extreme stress and exhaustion of the miners, but the consistency of the details across 70 years suggested a recurring phenomenon that wasn't tied to a specific group of people. The laborers believed the mountains held on to the sounds of the thousands of pack animals and people who had perished on the trail, though no one could explain why only a woman's voice was ever reported. The 1,974 maintenance crew eventually completed their work by shifting their schedule to the early morning hours, as they found the crying was most prevalent in the late afternoon and twilight. Even then, they worked in a state of hypervigilance, with several men refusing to move more than a few feet away from the rest of the group. The sense of being watched never fully dissipated, and the foreman noted in his final report that the site felt wrong on a fundamental level. He described it as a place where the air didn't move correctly and the shadows stayed too long. After the project was finished, 3 of the 5 crew members resigned from the railway, citing a desire to work in the lower valleys away from the isolation of the high passes. They remained reluctant to discuss the details of that week with anyone outside of their immediate families. A secondary report from a group of hikers who traversed the area in the summer of 1975 added another layer to the mystery. They claimed to have found a small, circular patch of ground near the tracks where no plants would grow, despite the surrounding area being lush with alpine wildflowers. When they sat down to rest near the patch, they all reported a sudden, overwhelming feeling of sadness and the sound of someone whispering just behind their ears. One hiker insisted she heard a woman's voice saying a specific date in October, though the date had no significance to any of them. They left the area quickly, reporting that the silence of the pass felt aggressive, as if it was intentionally muting their voices. Their description of the location perfectly matched the coordinates where the maintenance crew had experienced the most intense auditory distortions. The phenomenon of the crying woman has never been officially explained by acoustic experts or psychologists. Some researchers of the unexplained have suggested that the high quartz content in the surrounding granite might act as a natural transducer, catching and replaying sounds under specific atmospheric conditions. Others point to the unique shape of the valley, which might create an acoustic trap for distant sounds, though this doesn't explain the reactive nature of the voices or the physical sensations reported by witnesses. The magnetic anomalies and the temperature drops remain the only measurable evidence that something unusual occurs in that section of the White Pass. To the men who were there in 1974, the technical explanations are secondary to the raw emotional impact of the sound, which they described as the most lonely thing they had ever heard. The railway continues to operate today, with thousands of tourists passing through the area every summer. Most travelers see only the stunning vistas and the historic engineering of the tracks, unaware of the reports buried in the company's archives. The maintenance crews who work the line now are equipped with modern communication tools and GPS, but the older veterans still share stories of the section near the embankment where the radios go quiet. They advise the younger workers to stay focused on their tasks and to ignore any sounds that don't belong to the wind or the machinery. The belief that the pass is a place of echoes remains a quiet part of the local culture, a lingering reminder that some landscapes are more than just dirt and stone. The psychological aftermath for the lead foreman was particularly documented in a series of letters he wrote to a colleague in the late 70s. He described how he could still hear the sobbing in his sleep and how he could never quite shake the feeling that he had left something behind in the pass. He wasn't afraid of a ghost in the traditional sense, but he was disturbed by the idea that a human emotion like grief could be so powerful that it could stain the physical world for nearly a century. He spent much of his retirement researching the history of the gold rush, trying to find a name or a face that might fit the voice he heard, but the records were too fragmented, and the casualties of the trail were too numerous. The voice remained anonymous, a collective representation of a tragic era. In the mid-80s, a regional surveyor working on a new mapping project for the border area reported a similar experience while staying in a temporary camp near the same coordinates. He wasn't aware of the 1974 incident or the Gold Rush legends, yet his field notes described a persistent crying sound that interfered with his ability to concentrate. He noted that his surveying equipment gave inconsistent readings whenever the sound was present, suggesting a link between the auditory phenomenon and a localized distortion of the magnetic field. His notes also mentioned a series of dreams he had while at the site, involving a woman standing on the edge of the embankment looking down at the tracks. He described her not as a person, but as a shadow that was darker than the night sky. The consistency of the reports over such a long period of time has led some to believe that the White Pass is home to a specific type of environmental anomaly that science hasn't yet categorized. It is a place where the past and the present seem to overlap, creating a sensory experience that is both frightening and profoundly sad. The woman in the pass is not a monster or a threat, but a mystery that refuses to be solved. She is a reminder that there are still parts of the North that haven't been fully explored or understood, where the environment itself seems to remember things that the rest of the world has forgotten. The tracks continue to hum with the passage of the trains, and the wind continues to howl through the canyons, but the crying in the pass remains a constant, silent presence. There is a specific detail from the 1974 crew that often gets overlooked in the more sensational versions of the story. They mentioned that during the final hour of their last day on site, the crying suddenly stopped and was replaced by a sound like a single clear bell ringing in the distance. The air pressure immediately returned to normal, the color returned to the trees, and the dog finally stepped out of the maintenance car. This sudden resolution suggested that the phenomenon had a cycle or a conclusion, though it returned to its original state within a few months when the next group of workers entered the area. This cyclical nature points toward a natural process, albeit one that involves sensory and emotional elements we don't fully comprehend. The White Pass remains a site of immense beauty and hidden depths. The story of the crying woman is just one of many that have emerged from the rugged borderlands, where the boundary between two countries is also a boundary between the known and the unknown. Whether the sound is a geological quirk, an acoustic trick, or a genuine imprint of a historical tragedy, its impact on those who hear it is undeniable. It is a voice from a different time, speaking in the language of grief, and it continues to echo through the canyons of the North. The mountains do not give up their secrets easily, and the woman in the pass is one secret that they seem intent on keeping for as long as the tracks remain. The 1974 foreman once said that the most disturbing thing about the crying wasn't the sound itself, but the way it made him feel like a trespasser in his own life. He felt as though he had stepped into a room where a private conversation was happening, a conversation that had been going on since before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. This sense of being an outsider to a larger, invisible process is a common theme in high wilderness encounters. It is a reminder of the scale of the world and the limitations of human perception. The woman in the pass is a small part of that scale, a lone voice in a vast and indifferent landscape. As the years pass and the witnesses of the 1974 incident grow fewer, the story has begun to fade into the broader folklore of the Yukon. It is occasionally mentioned in regional history books as a curious footnote to the maintenance of the line, but the raw terror and sadness felt by the men are often lost in the retelling. Yet, for those who find themselves alone in the White Pass during the long twilight of a northern spring, the air still feels a little too cold, and the silence still feels a little too heavy. They keep their eyes on the tracks and their ears open for the sound of a train, hoping that the only thing they hear is the wind in the spruce trees. The regional archives in Skagway still hold the original maintenance logs from that week in 1974. Their pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting still clear. They stand as a primary document of a group of rational men confronted with the irrational. There are no mentions of ghosts or spirits in the logs, only descriptions of sounds, temperatures, and equipment failures. This clinical approach makes the reports even more unsettling, as it strips away the comfort of a traditional haunting and replaces it with a cold physical reality. The logs don't ask for belief, they simply state what happened, leaving the reader to draw their own conclusions about the nature of the pass. In 1992, an acoustic researcher from a Canadian university spent a week in the pass with high-sensitivity recording equipment, hoping to capture the crying woman on tape. He recorded hours of wind noise, the creaking of the tracks, and the occasional bird call, but he never heard the sobbing. However, when he returned to the lab to analyze the tapes, he found several sections of the recording where the background noise was completely replaced by a low-frequency hum that didn't correspond to any known environmental source. The hum appeared to have a rhythmic quality, almost like a slow, deep breathing. He couldn't explain how the sound was captured when he hadn't heard it at the time, leading to further questions about the relationship between the phenomenon and human consciousness. The White Pass and Yukon route remains a testament to human ingenuity and the drive to conquer the wilderness. But stories like the crying woman suggest that the conquest is never truly complete. There are parts of the land that remain wild, not because they haven't been built upon, but because they operate on a logic that we can't influence. The woman in the pass is a permanent resident of that wild space, a figure carved out of sound and shadow. She is a part of the mountain now, as much as the granite and the ice, and she will likely be there for as long as the wind has a canyon to blow through. For the tourists who ride the train today, the experience is one of luxury and spectacular views. They look out the windows at the same embankments and the same tree lines where the maintenance crew once stood in fear. They don't hear the crying over the sound of the engine and the chatter of their fellow passengers. But sometimes, when the train slows down to negotiate a particularly tight curve and the cabin goes quiet for a moment, a passenger will look out into the brush and see a pale shape moving through the trees. They'll tell themselves it was a patch of snow or a birch trunk, and they'll turn back to their conversation, unaware that they've just glimpsed the woman who never left. The 1974 incident remains a significant event for those who study the intersection of geography and psychology. It illustrates how a specific location can have a profound effect on the human mind, creating a shared experience that defies easy explanation. The maintenance crew weren't looking for a paranormal encounter. They were just trying to do their jobs. The fact that the environment forced itself upon them in such a dramatic way is a reminder of the power of place. The White Pass is not just a coordinate on a map. It is a repository of history and a generator of mystery. The final report from the supervisor who investigated the site mentioned that he found a small, rusted locket in the silt near the tracks. It was empty and had no identifying marks, but its presence in such a remote location was unusual. He didn't include it in the official company report, fearing it would lend too much weight to the local legends. He kept it in his desk for years, a small piece of metal that felt colder than it should have. He eventually returned it to the pass, burying it near the embankment where the crying was loudest. He said he did it to give the voice something to hold on to, though he couldn't explain why he felt that was necessary. The woman in the White Pass continues to be a subject of quiet speculation among those who know the region's history. She is a bridge between the desperate days of the gold rush and the modern world of the railway. She is a reminder of the thousands of stories that were started on the trail but never finished, the lives that were lost to the cold and the rugged terrain. Her voice is the only thing that remains of those forgotten people, a single, grieving sob that carries the weight of a century. The mountains are large enough to hold that grief, and the pass is long enough for the echo to never truly end. The 1,974 crew members are mostly gone now, their stories passed down to children and grandchildren who may or may not believe them, but the logs remain and the coordinates are still there. The embankment hasn't changed, and the trees still grow thin and stunted in the high-altitude air. The railway still runs, and the trains still climb the steep grades of the pass. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right and the air goes still, the crying begins again, moving along the ridge and whispering names into the wind. It is a part of the North, a part of the pass, and a part of the history of the people who tried to tame the mountains is less than number hashon. Zero hash is greater than. The enduring nature of the mystery is what keeps it alive in the regional consciousness. It's not a story with a beginning, middle, and end, but a continuous state of being. The woman in the pass is a fixture of the landscape, a sensory landmark for those who know how to listen. She doesn't need a name or a backstory to be real to those who have heard her. The raw fact of her voice is enough. It is a sound that cuts through the noise of the modern world and connects the listener to a more primal emotional reality. It is the sound of the White Pass, and it is a sound that will never be silenced. The transition from the 1,898 accounts to the 1,974 reports and beyond shows a remarkable stability in the phenomenon. The world changed around the White Pass, but the crying remained the same. It didn't evolve into a different sound or move to a different location. It stayed anchored to that specific stretch of track and that specific embankment. This stability suggests an environmental cause, something built into the very structure of the valley itself. It is a physical property of the pass, as much as its elevation or its climate. It is a mystery that is grounded in the earth, waiting for the next person to come along and hear it. As we look back at the 1,974 incident, we can see it as a moment where the modern world brushed up against something much older and more mysterious. The maintenance crew were men of their time, focused on machinery and schedules, but they were forced to confront a reality that didn't fit into their worldview. Their experience was a collision between the industrial and the primordial. It left them changed, and it left a record that continues to intrigue and unsettle. The woman in the pass is still there, and she is still crying, a lone voice in the vastness of the North, reminding us that some things are meant to be heard but never understood. The final legacy of the crying woman is the sense of wonder and humility she inspires in those who encounter her story. It is a reminder that our understanding of the world is incomplete and that there are still mysteries in our own backyards that we can't solve. The White Pass is a beautiful, dangerous, and mysterious place, and the woman in the pass is the perfect symbol of that complexity. She is a part of the landscape, a part of the history, and a part of the mystery that makes the North so compelling. We may never know who she was or why she is crying, but we know she is there, and that is enough. The 1,974 foreman's final diary entry regarding the project was brief and to the point. He wrote that the mountains don't care about the railway, and they don't care about the men who work on it. They have their own stories, and they play them back whenever they feel like it. He said he was glad to be leaving the pass, but he knew he would always be listening for that sound, no matter where he was. He understood that once you hear the woman in the pass, you never truly stop hearing her. The echo follows you home, a quiet reminder of the day the world went gray and the trees began to sob. The White Pass and Yukon route continues to be a vital link in the regional economy and a major attraction for visitors from around the world. The crying woman has become a part of its heritage, a ghost story that isn't quite a ghost story, a mystery that isn't quite a myth. She is a reality for those who have been there and a fascination for those who haven't. As long as the trains run and the mountains stand, the woman in the pass will continue to grieve, her voice a permanent part of the northern wind. She is the spirit of the trail, the memory of the pass, and the voice of the unknown, crying out from the woods where no one is there. The Geological Survey of the region has since identified several more magnetic anomalies along the route, though none are as concentrated as the area near the 1974 site. These findings provide a scientific framework for the equipment failures, but they still fail to explain the articulate human nature of the sounds. The gap between the measurable data and the lived experience is where the mystery lives. It is a gap that may never be closed, as the tools of science are often ill-equipped to deal with the nuances of human perception and emotion. The woman in the past exists in that gap, a figure of sound that defies measurement and demands to be felt. In the end, the story of the woman in the White Pass is a story about memory. It's about the memory of a landscape that has seen too much tragedy and the memory of a people who refuse to let the past disappear. The crying is a manifestation of that memory, a physical weight that the air itself carries. It is a reminder that we are never truly alone in the wilderness, as the land itself is filled with the echoes of those who came before. The woman in the pass is the keeper of those echoes, a silent guardian of a history that is written in sound. She is the White Pass, and she is crying for all of us. The 1974 maintenance crew's experience was a rare moment of clarity in a mystery that is usually shrouded in fog and distance. Their detailed reports and the official investigations that followed provided a rare glimpse into the mechanics of a haunting that isn't a haunting. It showed how a group of normal men can be affected by an abnormal environment and how the results can be both terrifying and profound. The woman in the pass is still there, and the next time the maintenance crew goes out to clear the tracks, they'll be listening. They'll be watching the tree line and checking their radios, hoping for a quiet shift, but prepared for the sound of a woman crying in the woods. The coordinates of the site are known to those who work the line, but they aren't marked on any public map. It's a place that you have to find for yourself, or perhaps a place that finds you. The embankment looks like any other, and the trees are no different from the thousands of others in the forest. But if you stand there long enough and the air goes still, you'll start to feel it. The pressure in your ears, the drop in temperature, and the sudden, overwhelming sense of grief. And then, out of the silence, the crying will begin. And you'll realize, just like the men in 1974, that some things in this world are real, even if they don't make any sense. The White Pass remains one of the most storied locations in the North, a place of legend and history. The Crying Woman is just one chapter in that long story, but it's a chapter that continues to be written. Every new report, every new sighting, and every new recording adds to the mystery. It's a story that will never be finished, as long as the mountains stand and the wind blows. The woman in the pass is a part of us now, a shared experience that connects us to the wild and the unknown. She is the voice of the wilderness, and she is still crying, waiting for the next person to listen. The 1974 foreman's final words on the matter were perhaps the most telling. He said that the crying woman wasn't a ghost of a person, but a ghost of a place. She was what happens when a landscape is pushed to its breaking point and then forced to remember it forever. He didn't know if that was true, but it was the only thing that made sense to him. It gave the sound a purpose and a meaning, even if it didn't make it any less frightening. The woman in the pass is the memory of the White Pass, and she will never let us forget what happened on the trail. The sun sets over the peaks of the Alaska Range, casting long shadows across the valley. The train whistle echoes in the distance, a modern sound in an ancient world. The maintenance crew packs up their tools and heads back to the station, the day's work done. The pass goes quiet, the only sound the rustle of the wind in the spruce trees. And then, from the embankment near the tracks, a low, rhythmic sob begins. It moves along the ridge, parallel to the empty rails, a voice crying out in the wilderness. There is no one there to hear it, but the sound doesn't care. It has its own reasons and its own story to tell. The White Pass is a place of beauty and tragedy, and the crying woman is the embodiment of both. She is a reminder of the power of the land and the endurance of human emotion. She is a mystery that refuses to be solved, a voice that refuses to be silenced. She is the woman in the pass, and she is still there, crying in the woods where no one is there. And as long as the mountains stand and the wind blows, she will continue to be a part of the North, a permanent resident of the White Pass, a mystery that will never end. In this new story, at 3:19 a.m., someone knocked on the bedroom wall from the inside. The structural integrity of a modern home is usually defined by the solid boundaries between the living spaces and the hollow voids within the walls. Most homeowners assume that the sounds they hear at night are just the house settling or the wind moving through the attic vents. However, the maintenance logs and acoustic recordings from a specific residence in rural Oregon suggest that some noises have a far more deliberate source. A quiet night in the suburbs can quickly turn into an investigation of things that should not exist behind the plaster and lath. Sterling Vance was a 44-year-old industrial architect who spent his days designing highly efficient layouts for massive distribution centers. He lived in a restored Victorian-era house that sat on a large wooded lot on the outskirts of a small mountain town. His primary goal for the year 2024 was to finish a series of complex blueprints for a new sustainable housing project. Sterling was a man of extreme logic and precision who did not believe in anything that could not be measured or mapped. He shared the large house with his wife and their young son, who both slept soundly through the quiet night hours. The incident began on a humid Tuesday in the month of August in the year 2024, during a localized thunderstorm. Sterling was working late in his home office when he heard a sharp and rhythmic thud coming from the bedroom hallway. He checked the digital clock on his desk and saw it was exactly 3:19 in the morning, which was very strange. He walked into the master bedroom where his wife was sleeping, and he stopped when he heard the sound again. It was a distinct knocking pattern that originated from deep within the shared wall between the bedroom and the master bathroom. The knocking was firm and intentional, as if someone was using a heavy knuckle to strike the wooden studs from the inside. Sterling felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the sound was coming from a space that had no physical access points. He used a professional-grade stud finder to scan the wall and found that the cavity was completely empty of pipes. There was no electrical wiring running through that specific section of the wall, which made the source of the noise even more. He stayed awake for the rest of the night and listened as the knocking continued at regular intervals until the sun rose. The next morning, Sterling began a step-by-step investigation of the house structure by reviewing the original architectural blueprints from archives. He was a meticulous man who kept detailed digital files of every renovation that had been performed on the property since 19. He discovered that the house had undergone a major structural change in the year 1955 following a small kitchen fire. The contractors at the time had sealed off a narrow service corridor that once ran between the main bedrooms and the plumbing. According to the archive notes from the state records, the corridor was used by staff to access the laundry chutes quickly. He searched the attic and the crawl space under the floorboards to find an entrance to this forgotten and sealed-off vertical space. He found a small access hatch hidden behind a heavy built-in bookshelf in the guest room that he had ignored. Sterling used a pry bar to open the hatch, and he was met with a cloud of gray dust and cold. He shone his powerful flashlight into the void and saw a narrow ladder leading down into the darkness between the bedroom walls. The air smelled of old paper and damp earth, which indicated that the space had not been ventilated for many decades. He climbed down the ladder and found a small wooden chair tucked into a corner that was only 2 feet wide. On the floor sat a collection of old rusted tins and a series of handwritten notes that were dated 1950. The notes were written by a man named Elias Thorne, who had worked as a maintenance man for the previous owners. Elias reportedly suffered from a severe sleep disorder and had created the hidden room as a place to find total silence. According to the county file from 2009, Elias had disappeared from the property without leaving any trace of his. Sterling noticed a series of tally marks carved into the wooden studs that matched the exact rhythm of the knocking he heard. The marks were grouped into sets of 3, which was the same pattern that had woken him up at 3:19. He realized that the knocking was not a haunting, but a mechanical echo caused by a weighted pendulum Elias had built. The device was designed to tap on the wall at a specific frequency to help the man fall into a deep. Over the years, the house had shifted and the pendulum had become stuck until the recent storm loosened the old mechanism. He decided to dismantle the old wooden device and seal the access hatch permanently to ensure the safety of his family. Sterling felt a sense of relief as he understood the logical cause of the mystery that had disturbed his quiet night. He updated his own home maintenance logs to include the discovery of the hidden service corridor for any future property owners. The knocking stopped completely, and the house returned to its normal state of peaceful silence for the rest of the season. He kept the handwritten notes in his office as a reminder of the man who sought silence in the walls. The house remains quiet now, and the digital logs no longer record any unusual acoustic spikes during the early morning hours. Sterling still checks the blueprints occasionally, but he knows that the boundaries of his home are now fully mapped and secure. He understands that some secrets are just forgotten pieces of engineering that are waiting to be found by the right person. The past has a way of leaving a physical mark on a house that survives through every new renovation and owner. He sleeps soundly, knowing that the only sounds he hears are the normal and predictable movements of a safe family. Every building tells a story if we are willing to look behind the plaster and listen to the echoes of construction. Sterling Vance continues to design his efficient layouts, but he now pays closer attention to the empty spaces in between the walls. He knows that the logic of architecture can often hide the small and human details of those who lived there before. The town remains peaceful, and the Victorian house stands as a silent witness to the history of those who saw it. He closes his laptop and turns off the office light with a sense of total and complete architectural clarity tonight. The investigation concluded that no physical intruder had ever been present within the walls of the Sterling residence during the incident. Local investigators never confirmed the claims of previous tenants, who spoke of strange movements in the hallways during the winter months. Records conflict regarding the final fate of Elias Thorne, but the notes he left behind remain a tangible piece of evidence. Sterling often wonders how many other homes have hidden corridors that have been lost to time and forgotten by the living. He values the silence of his home more than ever now that he knows exactly what lies within the structure. The mystery was solved by a man of logic who refused to accept anything less than the physical truth today. In this new story, the Appalachian Mountains don't let you leave. The thick canopy of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia has a way of swallowing sound long before it reaches the nearest paved road. In the late summer of 1994, a group of experienced hikers set out for a 4-day trek through a remote section of the Cranberry Wilderness, an area known for its dense thickets and unpredictable weather. They weren't looking for anything beyond a quiet escape from their suburban lives, but the environment began to shift in ways that none of them could rationally explain within the first 24 hours. It started with a collective sensation of being watched from the tree line, a feeling so pervasive that the group stopped talking entirely to listen for footsteps that never quite synchronized with their own. The air felt heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself rather than the wind in the trees. As the first evening approached, the group found a flat clearing to set up their tents, but the forest around them remained unnaturally silent. Usually, the Appalachian woods at night are a chaotic symphony of insects, owls, and small mammals moving through the underbrush, but this particular night was marked by a total absence of biological noise. One hiker reported that even the campfire didn't seem to crackle the way it should, as if the oxygen in the area was too thin or the sound was being muffled by an invisible barrier. They sat in a tight circle, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, where the shadows of the spruce trees seemed to elongate and retract independently of the flickering flames. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit they felt an overwhelming urge to pack up and run back toward the trailhead in the middle of the night. When morning broke, the orientation of their campsite appeared subtly different than it had been when they went to sleep. The lead hiker, who had navigated these trails for over a decade, noted that the sun was rising over a ridge that should have been to their west if their compass readings from the previous night were accurate. They checked their equipment only to find that 3 separate compasses were spinning lazily in circles, unable to find a magnetic north. There was no storm, no nearby power lines, and no geological reason for such a massive magnetic disturbance in that specific limestone-heavy region. They decided to head back the way they came, but the trail they had clearly carved through the brush the day before was gone, replaced by a wall of ancient, undisturbed rhododendrons that looked like they hadn't been touched in a century. The sense of spatial distortion grew more intense as they attempted to backtrack using the sun as a guide. They walked for 6 hours at a steady pace, which should have put them back at their original starting point, but they instead found themselves standing in the exact same clearing they had left that morning. Their own footprints from the night before were missing, yet their discarded fire pit and the flattened grass where their tents had been remained perfectly intact. It was as if the world outside that small circle had reset itself while they were moving. Panic began to set in among the younger members of the group, who claimed the trees were literally shifting positions when they weren't looking directly at them. The light in the forest took on a bruised, purplish hue that didn't correspond with the time of day or the clear sky visible through the breaks in the canopy. By the second night, the psychological strain was manifesting as physical symptoms. Several hikers complained of a metallic taste in their mouths and a persistent ringing in their ears that made communication difficult. They tried to keep a log of their experiences, but when they looked at the notebooks later, the writing appeared as illegible scribbles that didn't resemble their own handwriting. One witness claimed she saw a figure standing just outside the reach of their flashlight beams, describing it not as a person or an animal, but as a hole in the darkness that was darker than the night surrounding it. This presence didn't move or make a sound, yet everyone in the group felt a cold chill wash over them whenever they turned their heads in that direction. They stopped trying to sleep, staying awake in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on delirium. The third day was defined by a total loss of time perception. According to their watches, only 2 hours passed between sunrise and sunset, yet they felt they had been walking for an eternity through a landscape that had become increasingly alien. The familiar flora of West Virginia had been replaced by strange, pale fungi and twisted gray wood that looked petrified. They came across a small creek that was flowing uphill, defying gravity in a slow, viscous crawl over jagged rocks. No one dared to touch the water, fearing that the laws of physics in this pocket of the wilderness had completely collapsed. The lead hiker later recalled that his mind felt like it was being compressed, filled with static and fragmented memories of places he had never been. They eventually stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin that wasn't marked on any of their topographical maps. The structure was built from logs that looked far too large for any human to have moved, and it lacked windows or a chimney. Despite the heat of the afternoon, a thick frost covered the doorframe, and the air surrounding the cabin was cold enough to see their breath. One member of the group insisted they go inside for shelter, but as he approached the door, he stopped dead in his tracks and refused to move. He later described hearing hundreds of voices whispering from inside the wood itself, all of them speaking in a language that sounded like grinding stones and rushing water. They retreated from the cabin, moving with a desperate energy they didn't know they still possessed. As they fled the vicinity of the cabin, the forest suddenly snapped back into a recognizable state. The compasses jerked back to north, the birds began to sing again, and the trail they had been looking for appeared directly in front of them as if it had been there the whole time. They ran for miles, not stopping until they reached the gravel parking lot where their vehicles were stationed. When they checked the date on the dashboard of their car, they realized they had been missing for 8 days, not the 4 they had planned or the 3 they had perceived. Their bodies were malnourished and covered in scratches, but they had no memory of the additional 4 days that had vanished from their lives. Local authorities conducted a brief investigation after the hikers reported their experience, but search parties found nothing unusual in the area where the group claimed to have been lost. There were no strange cabins, no magnetic anomalies, and no evidence of a creek that flowed uphill. The official report chalked the incident up to mass hysteria triggered by dehydration and the disorienting nature of the deep wilderness. However, the hikers remained adamant that what they experienced was a physical reality, not a mental breakdown. One of them never fully recovered, spending years in and out of clinics, claiming that he could still hear the grinding voices of the trees whenever the wind picked up. The mystery of the Cranberry Wilderness incident remains a quiet legend among local woodsmen and researchers of the unexplained. Some suggest the area sits on a geological fault line that occasionally leaks exotic gases, causing hallucinations and time distortion. Others believe the Appalachian Mountains are far older than the life forms currently inhabiting them, and that the land itself occasionally tires of human presence, folding in on itself to hide away from the modern world. The hikers involved have all refused to return to the forest, and most of them have moved away from the region entirely, unable to look at the rolling green hills without feeling the weight of that missing time pressing down on their chests. The woods remain there, vast and indifferent, holding on to whatever occurred in that clearing during those 8 lost days. Deep in the archives of regional newspapers, there are sporadic accounts from the 1920s and 1950s that mirror the 1994 event with startling accuracy. Hunters described finding themselves in valleys that didn't exist, where the sun stayed in the same spot for 12 hours and the trees had no leaves despite it being the height of summer. These accounts were often dismissed as tall tales or the ramblings of men who had spent too much time alone in the brush. Yet, when placed side by side with the 1994 testimony, a pattern emerges of a recurring phenomenon that seems to target those who venture too far off the established paths. It is a reminder that the maps we rely on are only as good as the reality they represent, and sometimes that reality is more fluid than we are comfortable admitting. The physical evidence of the hikers' ordeal was limited to their deteriorated health and the strange metallic residue found on their clothing, which laboratory tests were unable to identify as any known industrial lubricant or natural sap. The residue was non-toxic, but had a crystalline structure that seemed to vibrate when exposed to certain frequencies of sound. This small detail was never included in the public reports, buried instead in a technical file that few have ever accessed. It suggests that whatever they encountered had a physical presence, something that could leave a mark on the world even if the world wasn't ready to acknowledge it. For the people who lived through it, the lack of an official explanation is a secondary concern to the fact that they survived at all. The forest doesn't offer up its secrets easily, and the Monongahela National Forest is a place of deep shadows and even deeper history. The indigenous tribes that once moved through these mountains spoke of places where the veil between worlds was thin, where a person could step behind a tree and emerge in a land that didn't know the sun. These warnings have been forgotten by the modern world, replaced by a sense of dominance over nature that is easily shattered when the compass fails and the trail disappears. The hikers were lucky to have found their way back, a feat that not everyone who goes missing in the Appalachians manages to accomplish. Each year, people vanish in these woods without a trace, leaving behind only empty campsites and unanswered questions. When we look at the vast stretches of wilderness remaining in the United States, we like to think of them as managed resources or recreational playgrounds. But stories like this suggest they are something else, entirely remnants of a primordial world that operates on a logic we no longer understand. The experience in the Cranberry Wilderness wasn't a crime, and it wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. It was an encounter with the unknown in its purest form, a reminder that there are still places on this earth where we are not the primary inhabitants. The mountains stand as silent witnesses to these events, their ancient peaks watching over the valleys where time and space sometimes forget to behave. The lasting impact on the witnesses is perhaps the most documented aspect of the case. They didn't just lose time, they lost their sense of security in the physical world. One hiker reported that for years afterward, he couldn't stand to be in a room with a ticking clock, as the steady rhythm reminded him of the erratic, stuttering heartbeat of the forest during their 3rd day. Another became obsessed with mapping the area using satellite imagery, looking for any sign of the log cabin or the uphill creek, But the digital eyes in the sky showed only an unbroken sea of green. The frustration of knowing something happened, but being unable to prove it, is a specific kind of haunting that doesn't require a ghost. In the end, the Appalachian incident of 1994 serves as a modern folktale, a cautionary story for those who think they can master the wild. It sits in the gray area between science and myth, where witness perception is the only evidence we have of things that shouldn't be possible. As the years pass, the details might blur and the survivors might stop talking about it, but the forest remains. It waits for the next group of hikers to wander a little too far, to ignore the silence, and to step into a clearing where the rules of the world no longer apply. The mountain doesn't care if you believe in it, it only cares that you are there. The silence that the group first noticed has been described by acoustic experts as a possible acoustic shadow, a rare phenomenon where sound waves are diverted by atmospheric conditions or complex terrain. While this might explain the lack of noise, it fails to account for the visual distortions, the magnetic failure, and the discrepancy in time. The psychological theory of folie à plusieurs, or shared psychosis, is often cited in cases of group sightings, suggesting that one person's fear can trigger hallucinations in others. But even that theory struggles with the 8-day disappearance and the physical toll on the hikers' bodies. Each explanation covers a fragment of the truth, but leaves the core of the experience untouched. Observers of the paranormal often point to the high concentration of iron and quartz in the Appalachian Range as a possible catalyst for strange events. These minerals can conduct and store energy in ways that are still being studied, potentially creating localized pockets of electromagnetic interference. If the conditions are exactly right, it is theorized that these pockets could cause a sensory overload or even a rift in how we perceive the passage of time. Whether this is what happened in West Virginia is a matter of speculation, but it provides a framework for understanding how a natural environment could produce such an unnatural experience. The land is not just a backdrop, it is an active participant in the story. The cabin the hikers encountered remains the most chilling detail for those who study the case. In many similar reports of missing time in the wilderness, witnesses describe seeing structures that don't belong buildings, that look too old, too new, or constructed from impossible materials. These phantom structures often act as a focal point for the most intense experiences before vanishing entirely. If the cabin in the Cranberry Wilderness was such a place, it suggests that the environment was projecting a physical manifestation of the group's internal dread, or that they had briefly entered a layer of reality where the cabin was a permanent fixture. Either way, the decision to not enter the structure likely saved their lives, or at least their sanity. The final report from the lead hiker ended with a simple statement that has since been quoted in various independent journals. He wrote that he no longer felt like a visitor in the woods, but like a trespasser who had been caught and then released for reasons he would never know. That feeling of being an unwelcome guest in a vast, ancient house is something that many who spend time in the deep Appalachians can relate to. There is a sense of age there that predates human concern, a weight of millions of years that makes our modern lives feel incredibly fragile. When the mountains decide to remind us of that scale, they do so with a terrifying and quiet efficiency. As we move further into the 21st century, with GPS and constant connectivity, the idea of getting lost in time seems like a relic of the past. But the 1994 incident reminds us that technology is only as good as the reality it is plugged into. If the environment itself changes, the tools we use to measure it become useless. The hikers had the best equipment available at the time, and it failed them completely the moment they stepped into that acoustic shadow. It is a humbling thought that for all our progress, we are still subject to the whims of the earth and the strange, unresolved pockets of mystery that it chooses to keep. The story of the lost hikers of West Virginia is not a ghost story, and it is not a story of a monster in the dark. It is a story about the land itself. and the way it can sometimes turn a mirror back on us, showing us how little we actually know about the world we inhabit. The unresolved tension of the case lies in the fact that it could happen again tomorrow to anyone with a backpack and a sense of adventure. The Monongahela National Forest continues to draw thousands of visitors every year, most of whom have a wonderful, uneventful time. But the clearing is still out there, somewhere in the dense spruce and rhododendron, waiting for the sun to rise in the west and the voices to start whispering from the wood. In the decades since, the survivors have mostly stayed out of the spotlight, preferring to move on from a week that cost them so much. The few interviews they gave in the late 90s are the primary source of our understanding, providing a vivid and consistent picture of a reality gone wrong. They don't look for fame or validation, they just want to live in a world where the compass points north and the days last 24 hours. Their experience serves as a silent landmark in the history of the American paranormal, a documented event that defies easy categorization and refuses to be forgotten. The Appalachian Mountains keep their secrets, but they sometimes leave a few survivors behind to tell the tale. The weather patterns in that part of West Virginia are notoriously fickle, often shifting from clear skies to dense fog in a matter of minutes. Meteorologists have studied the region's microclimates, noting that the deep valleys can trap air and create unique atmospheric lenses. While this can explain some of the visual distortions reported by hikers over the years, it doesn't touch the depth of the 1,994 experience. The hikers weren't just seeing things through a fog, they were interacting with a world that had fundamentally altered its behavior. The fog they experienced wasn't made of water vapor. It was a fog of the mind and of time itself. The legacy of the incident has influenced how some outdoor enthusiasts approach the Appalachian backcountry. There are now groups who specifically look for these thin places, using sensors and cameras to try and catch a glimpse of the shifting reality the hikers described. So far, they have found nothing but the same beautiful, rugged wilderness that has always been there. It seems the phenomenon isn't something that can be hunted or summoned. It is something that happens to you when you are least prepared for it. It is a spontaneous collapse of the expected, a momentary glitch in the grand machinery of the natural world. As the sun sets over the ridges of the Monongahela today, the shadows still stretch long across the forest floor. The wind still whistles through the needles of the high-altitude spruce trees, and the creeks still tumble over ancient stones. To most, it is a place of peace and renewal. But for those who know the story of the 1994 trek, the beauty of the landscape is tempered by a lingering question. What happens when the forest stops being a place and starts being a presence? The answer is buried somewhere in those 8 missing days, in the silence of a campfire that wouldn't crackle and the memory of a cabin that wasn't there. The final takeaway from this event is the importance of witness testimony in the face of the unexplainable. Without the detailed accounts provided by the hikers, this would have been just another missing persons case that ended with a fortunate discovery. Instead, it is a documented exploration into the limits of human perception and the potential for the world to be far more complex than our maps suggest. The hikers' bravery in sharing their story, despite the inevitable skepticism, has provided a valuable data point for anyone trying to understand the mysteries of the American wilderness. They remind us that the most frightening things aren't always what we find in the dark, but what we find when the light itself starts to change. The case remains open in the minds of many, a puzzle with pieces that will never quite fit together. There is no closure to be found in a story where the primary antagonist is the landscape itself. There are only theories, whispers, and the enduring silence of the mountains. Those who walk the trails of the Cranberry Wilderness today do so in the footsteps of those who came before, perhaps unaware that they are treading on ground that once forgot how to be real. The Appalachian Mountains don't let you leave easily, and for some, they never truly let go at all. The metallic taste, the ringing in the ears, and the visual bruises in the sky are all hallmarks of intense electromagnetic exposure, yet no source for such energy has ever been identified in that wilderness. It is as if the Earth itself generated a pulse that temporarily rewrote the local laws of physics. If such a thing is possible, it suggests that our planet has systems and cycles that we haven't even begun to map. We are like ants walking across a circuit board, unaware of the power flowing beneath our feet until a spark jumps and changes our world forever. The hikers were caught in that spark, and they carry the heat of it with them to this day. Ultimately, the 1994 Appalachian incident stands as a testament to the enduring power of the unknown. In an age where everything is recorded and analyzed, it is a rare thing to encounter a mystery that remains so stubbornly unresolved. It challenges our desire for neat endings and scientific certainty, leaving us instead with the raw, unsettling reality of an experience that shouldn't have happened. The mountains are old, far older than our records and our reasons, and they will likely be there long after our stories have faded into the soil. Until then, we listen to the whispers in the trees and watch the compass, hoping it stays true. The group's decision to stay together was likely the only reason they all made it out. In many other cases of missing time or spatial distortion, individuals who become separated are often never seen again or are found miles away in areas that should have been impossible for them to reach on foot. The collective strength of the hikers provided a psychological anchor that kept them grounded even as their surroundings became untethered. It highlights the social nature of our reality. We rely on each other to confirm that what we are seeing is real. When that reality starts to fray, the presence of others is the only thing that keeps us from drifting away with it. So, the next time you find yourself in the deep woods and the birds suddenly stop singing, take a moment to check your compass. If the needle starts to spin and the trail behind you looks a little too overgrown, remember the hikers of the Monongahela. The world is a vast place, and not all of it has been tamed by the lines we draw on our maps. Some parts of the mountains still belong to the silence, and that silence has a memory that stretches back to the beginning of time. Stay on the path, watch the sun, and listen for the sound of your own footsteps, because in the Appalachians, the mountains are always watching back. In this new story, she woke up to find handprints on the mattress next to her. The physical environment of a modern home is often perceived as a fixed and unchanging sanctuary, where the placement of objects remains constant throughout the night. Most people assume that any change in the topography of their living space requires a direct and identifiable force to act upon it. However, the forensic logs and archived digital images from a quiet residence in suburban Maryland suggest that some impressions are left by sources that defy immediate physical explanation. A routine morning of waking up can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when the evidence of a presence is literally pressed into the fabric of the bed. Juliana Vance was a 38-year-old forensic accountant who spent her professional hours analyzing complex financial data to identify patterns of fraud for federal agencies. She lived alone in a high-security townhome that she had recently purchased on the outskirts of a growing tech corridor. His primary goal for the year 2024 was to finalize a series of high-stakes audits that required her total and absolute focus during the day. Juliana was a woman of extreme objectivity who relied on evidence and tangible data to navigate every aspect of her life. She followed a strict nightly routine of securing her home and calibrating her biometric sleep sensors before resting for the evening. The incident began on a humid Tuesday in the month of August in the year 2024, during a period of heavy coastal fog. Juliana woke up at precisely 3:19 in the morning and felt an unusual chill in the air that seemed to originate from the empty side of her king-sized bed. She turned on the bedside lamp and was startled to find a series of deep and fresh handprints pressed into the mattress topper right beside her. The impressions were large and clearly defined, as if someone had been leaning over her while she was in a deep state of sleep. She checked the bedroom door and confirmed it was still locked, and the motion sensors in the hallway had remained completely silent. She grabbed her professional-grade digital camera to document the impressions before the memory foam could return to its original and flat state. The forensic logs from the camera indicated that the handprints were exactly 11 inches in length and possessed a unique ridge pattern that did not match her own. Juliana felt a surge of cold adrenaline as she realized that the pressure required to create such deep marks would have necessitated a weight of at least 200 pounds. She immediately reviewed the local server logs for her security system and found that no exterior or interior alarms had been triggered during the night. The high-definition footage from the bedroom entrance showed the door remained closed and undisturbed for the entire duration of the storm. The next morning, Juliana began a step-by-step investigation of the property by reviewing the state records regarding the history of the original land plot. She was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every structural change and utility maintenance that had been performed on the townhome. She discovered that the residential neighborhood was built on the site of a former industrial laundry facility that had operated during the 1950s. According to the archive notes from a county file from 2009, the facility had experienced a major steam pipe explosion that resulted in several fatalities. The archives indicated that one of the victims was a maintenance foreman who was reportedly found near the area where her bedroom was now located. She searched the digital archives of the local historical society and found a series of recordings from the early development of the suburban corridor. These files described a man named Silas Thorne who was known for his habit of checking the temperature of the industrial equipment with his bare hands. Silas had reportedly survived for several hours after the explosion and was described as having a grip that left permanent marks on the metal pipes he held. The witness statements from the original investigation mentioned that the foreman was often seen patrolling the site of the laundry even after the facility was closed and demolished. Juliana realized that the handprints on her mattress matched the anatomical descriptions of the foreman's large and scarred hands in the report. The forensic images from the incident were reviewed by an independent consultant who found that the temperature of the mattress in the impressions was 15 degrees lower than the surrounding fabric. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a physical intruder within the townhome, and the biometric sensors showed Juliana's heart rate had spiked only after she woke up. Records conflict regarding the exact location of the steam pipe explosion, but some locals claimed the site was prone to unusual thermal anomalies and cold spots. Juliana decided to keep a thermal imaging camera active in her bedroom and continued to monitor the mattress for any signs of recurring pressure. She kept the original forensic logs on a secure drive as a record of the night that her sanctuary was breached by a weightless force. The townhome remains occupied today as Juliana continues her work with a new focus on the environmental anomalies of her living space. She still reviews the high-definition images of the handprints occasionally, but she remains unable to find a mechanical or structural reason for the localized depressions. The final report is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple physical or psychological explanation in the modern world. She sleeps with a secondary light source now because she knows that some impressions are left by those who are no longer there to explain them. Some properties carry a memory that is pressed into the very materials we use to find comfort in the quiet of the night. The engineering community still discusses the Juliana Vance case as an example of potential memory foam failure or localized atmospheric pressure changes in sealed environments. However, Juliana knows that what she photographed was not a material defect, but a factual record of a presence that was seeking a point of contact. She spends her time now researching the intersection of historical industrial sites and the modern residential structures that are built over the forgotten tragedies of the past. The townhome stands as a silent witness to the man who is still trying to find his way through the fog of a long-gone shift. She closes her laptop and turns off the desk lamp with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the weight of the past. The final entry in the county file regarding the industrial laundry explosion noted that the foreman was a man of immense dedication to his crew and his equipment. This detail suggests that the presence Juliana felt was not one of malice, but of a routine that had been repeated for thousands of days. It suggests that the room was acting as a resonance chamber for the final and most desperate moments of a man who refused to leave his post. Juliana believes that the handprints were a bridge between the past and the present that allowed a forgotten story to be seen one last time. The impressions beside her were merely a reminder that we are never truly the first to occupy the spaces we call our own. The quiet streets of Maryland rarely make the national news for anything other than routine political events and standard traffic reports for the busy corridor. Yet underneath the surface of the modern townhomes, there are stories that remain recorded in the deep layers of the local digital archives. Juliana Vance is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive for future study. She continues to document every anomaly with the same professional objectivity because she knows that the truth is often found in the smallest of details. The reality of the handprints is a mystery that requires us to acknowledge the things that we cannot simply explain away with logic. The study of the townhome's thermal resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under a restricted access report. No further impressions have been reported by Juliana, as the room's climate control system was updated to maintain a more consistent and stable environment throughout the night. The memory of the handprints on the mattress remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that locked and secure room. Juliana has moved on with her career, but she never forgets to check the surface of her bed every single morning when she first wakes up. She knows that the past is always looking for a way to leave a mark on the technology and the lives of the future. The legacy of the maintenance foreman is now a part of the local lore that the residents discuss in their private online forums during the long winter. They talk about the man who died in the explosion and the forensic accountant who found the heat of a ghost in her own bed. For Juliana, it isn't a story for a dinner party, but a technical record of a night that changed her understanding of the world around her. She continues to design her security protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a secure and private environment for her family. The walls are only the beginning of the defense against a world that we are still learning to measure in the darkness. The final report on the property noted that the foundation had experienced a localized cooling effect due to the proximity of the old industrial drainage system. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the thermal anomalies that Juliana had originally sought to quantify with her professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a heat sink for the forgotten machinery that still sits buried deep beneath the modern flooring and walls. Juliana looks at the floor and wonders how many other people are sleeping on top of the stories of those who built the world. She understands now that the most important evidence is often the kind that vanishes before the sun has a chance to rise. The townhome remains a dark silhouette against the foggy Maryland skyline, while the forensic accountant continues to search for the patterns in the data. Juliana Vance keeps her focus on the numbers, but she is always watching for the shape of a hand that doesn't belong to her. She knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right moment to be seen by an objective and patient observer. The silence of the morning is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everything that happened before she arrived. She sleeps soundly now, knowing that the watchman has finally left his mark and found his way back into the archives of the past. In this new story, a man recorded himself sleeping. Something sat on the bed at 2:41 a.m. The psychological barrier between deep REM sleep and the physical reality of one's bedroom is often thought to be impenetrable without a direct external stimulus. Most people who record their own sleep patterns expect to find nothing more than a few hours of restless tossing or the occasional sound of heavy breathing. However, the forensic digital logs and high-definition video files from a quiet residence in suburban Tennessee suggest that the environment remains active even when the occupant is unconscious. A routine attempt to diagnose a sleep disorder can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when the footage reveals a physical weight pressing down on the mattress. Kellen Vance was a 34-year-old software developer who lived alone in a newly renovated bungalow located in a peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts of Nashville. He was a man of strict routine and technical precision who'd recently started experiencing unexplained fatigue and a sensation of heavy pressure on his chest during the night. His primary goal for the month of November in the year 2024 was to use high-sensitivity motion tracking cameras to identify the cause of his disrupted rest. Kellen didn't believe in anything that couldn't be explained by a mechanical glitch or a biological anomaly, so he set up a professional-grade recording rig directed at his bed. He relied on real-time data and infrared sensors to ensure that every movement within the room was documented with absolute clarity for his upcoming medical consultation. The incident began on a humid Tuesday in the month of November in the year 2024, during a period of unseasonably warm autumn weather. Kellen reviewed the footage from the previous night and felt a surge of cold adrenaline when the time code reached exactly 2:41 in the morning. The high-definition infrared feed showed Kellen lying perfectly still in a deep sleep, but the surface of the mattress suddenly began to sink. A distinct, localized depression appeared on the right side of the bed, creating the unmistakable shape of someone sitting down right beside his hip. The pressure was so significant that the wooden frame of the bed emitted a sharp, audible creak that was clearly captured by the high-fidelity microphones. The depression remained static for exactly 12 minutes, while Kellen's own breathing became shallow and rhythmic on the recording. The camera's motion tracking software highlighted the area of the mattress that was under stress, but it failed to identify a physical body causing the weight. Kellen zoomed in on the fabric of the sheets and noticed that they were being pulled taut toward the center of the depression, as if by a physical force. At precisely 2:53 in the morning, the mattress suddenly sprang back to its original position and the room returned to a state of total stillness. He checked the biometric logs from his smartwatch and discovered that his heart rate had spiked to over 100 beats per minute during the exact duration of the event. The next morning, Kellen began a step-by-step investigation of the property by reviewing the state records regarding the history of the original structure before the renovation. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every structural change and utility maintenance that had been performed on the bungalow since he purchased it. He discovered that the house sat on a site that had previously been a small, private infirmary used during the early 1920s for long-term care. According to a county file from 2009, the infirmary had specialized in treating patients with severe respiratory ailments who required constant monitoring throughout the night. The archives indicated that a dedicated nurse had died of exhaustion in the exact location where his bedroom was now situated. He searched the digital archives of the local historical society and found a series of recordings from the original estate executors regarding the final days of the infirmary. These files described a woman named Silas Thorne who was known for her habit of sitting on the edge of her patients' beds to comfort them during the early morning hours. Silas had reportedly been found slumped over a chair in the hallway after a 48-hour shift, having never left her post to seek rest for herself. The witness statements from the original investigation mentioned that the infirmary was often filled with the sound of phantom footsteps and the sensation of being watched. Kellen realized that the anatomical scale of the depression on his mattress matched the physical descriptions of the nurse mentioned in the historical report. The infrared footage was reviewed by a local digital forensics expert who found that the camera's sensors had recorded a localized thermal drop of 10 degrees in the area of the depression. Investigators never confirmed the presence of an intruder within the house, as the smart locks and window sensors showed no activity throughout the night. Records conflict regarding the exact nature of the structural settling that occurred during the renovation, with some contractors claiming the floorboards were prone to shifting under pressure. Kellen decided to install a secondary thermal imaging array and continued to monitor the bed for any signs of the recurring weight. He kept the original 2:41 a.m. recording on a secure encrypted drive as a record of the night that his sleep was shared by a weightless presence. The property remains under constant observation today as Kellen continues his work with a new focus on the environmental anomalies of his living space. He still reviews the 12 minutes of static pressure occasionally, but he remains unable to find a software glitch or a mechanical failure in the mattress or the bed frame. The final report is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple physical or biological explanation in the modern era. He sleeps with a secondary light source now because he knows that some presences don't need to be seen to make their physical impact felt. Some locations carry a memory that is recorded in the very tension of the furniture and the surrounding atmosphere of the home. The engineering community still discusses the Kellen Vance footage as an example of potential sensor ghosting or high-frequency vibrations causing localized material fatigue. However, Kellen knows that what his cameras captured was not a hardware failure, but a factual record of a routine that was older than the house itself. He spends his time now researching the intersection of historical medical sites and the modern residential structures that are built over the forgotten rooms of the past. The bungalow stands as a silent witness to the nurse who was still trying to provide comfort to those in her care long after the facility was closed. He closes his laptop and turns off the office light with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the weight in the dark. The final entry in the county file regarding the death of the nurse noted that she was a woman of immense empathy and a terrifyingly focused sense of duty. This detail suggests that the presence Kellen detected was not a malicious entity, but an echo of a responsibility that had been repeated for thousands of nights. It suggests that the bedroom floor was acting as a storage medium for the final, weary actions of a woman who refused to leave her patients alone. Kellen believes that the 2:41 a.m. event was a bridge between the past and the present that allowed a forgotten duty to be seen one last time. The depression on the bed was merely a reminder that the care we give to others can leave an impression that survives long after we are gone. The quiet suburbs of Tennessee rarely make the national news for anything other than routine property development reports and standard seasonal festivals for the community. Yet, underneath the surface of the modern residential neighborhoods, there are stories that remain recorded in the deep, unindexed layers of the local digital archives. Kellen Vance is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive for future study. He continues to document every biometric spike with the same professional objectivity because he knows that the truth is often found in the things that shouldn't be heavy. The reality of the sitting figure is a mystery that requires us to acknowledge the things that we cannot simply explain away with a medical diagnosis. The study of the property's electromagnetic and material resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under restricted access for further review. No further long-duration depressions have been reported by Kellen, as the room's climate control system was updated to maintain a more consistent and stable environment. The memory of the mattress sinking in an empty room remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that quiet sanctuary. Kellen has moved on with his career, but he never forgets to check the 2:41 a.m. logs every single morning when he first logs into his server. He knows that the past is always looking for a way to leave a physical signature on the technology and the lives of the future. The legacy of the nurse is now a part of the local lore that the neighborhood residents discuss in their private social media groups during the long autumn nights. They talk about the woman who died at her post and the software developer who found the weight of a ghost on his high-definition monitor. For Kellen, it isn't a story for a campfire, but a technical record of a night that changed his understanding of what it means to be truly alone. He continues to design his home monitoring protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a secure and private environment for his family. The cameras are only the beginning of the observation of a world that we're still learning to measure in the darkness. The final report on the property noted that the foundation had experienced a localized cooling effect due to the proximity of an old underground spring that once supplied the infirmary. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the thermal anomalies that Kellen had originally sought to quantify with his professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a natural heatsink for the forgotten structure and the memories that were once contained within its walls. Kellen looks at the empty side of his bed and wonders how many other people are sleeping on top of the stories of those who built the world. He understands now that the most important data is often the kind that requires a silent night to even begin to notice. The bungalow remains a dark silhouette against the Tennessee skyline, while the developer continues to search for the patterns in the encrypted logs. Kellen Vance keeps his focus on the data, but he's always watching for the shape of a hand that doesn't belong to the living world anymore. He knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right moment to be seen by an objective and technical observer. The silence of the house is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everything that happened before he arrived. He sleeps soundly now, knowing that the nurse has finally been documented and found her way back into the digital archives of the past. In this news story, if you hear it in Appalachia, don't answer. The dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains in the United States have long been the subject of reports involving auditory anomalies that defy standard acoustic explanation. Local archives and regional newspaper records from the late 20th century contain numerous accounts of hikers and residents experiencing sounds that appeared to mimic human distress with unsettling precision. These incidents are frequently documented in the high-altitude regions of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the topography creates complex echoing patterns. Witnesses often describe a specific phenomenon where a familiar voice is heard calling from a location that is physically inaccessible or demonstrably empty. Investigators and park officials have historically attributed these reports to a combination of wind shear, local wildlife, and the psychological effects of prolonged isolation in deep wilderness. In the summer of 1994, a research assistant named Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote section of the Great Smoky Mountains to conduct a survey of local migratory patterns. Thorne was a 29-year-old graduate student with extensive experience in wilderness survival and field observation. He was assigned to a high-elevation ridge that remained largely undisturbed by commercial tourism or heavy hiking traffic. His primary objective was to maintain a series of acoustic recording stations designed to capture the vocalizations of rare bird species. The environment was characterized by steep inclines, dense laurel thickets, and a persistent fog that often reduced visibility to less than 30 feet. Thorne lived in a small, state-owned cabin that was accessible only by a narrow pack trail and remained miles away from the nearest paved road. According to archived field notes recovered from the Regional Forestry Department, the first week of the assignment passed without any significant deviation from standard procedure. Thorne recorded routine environmental data and maintained his equipment according to the strict protocols established by the university. On the evening of July 12th, the weather shifted as a localized thermal inversion trapped a heavy layer of moisture against the ridge. Thorne reported in his daily log that the forest became unusually silent, with a total absence of the typical insect and bird activity. At approximately 11:45 in the evening, he heard a sound originating from the ravine directly below the cabin porch. The sound was a clear, high-pitched voice that appeared to be calling his name with a flat, mechanical cadence. Thorne did not immediately respond to the vocalization, because the distance and the terrain made the presence of another person highly improbable at that hour. He remained inside the cabin and observed the perimeter through the single window facing the ravine. The voice continued for nearly 20 minutes, repeating his name at precise 60-second intervals. Each repetition lacked the natural inflection of a human in distress, sounding more like a pre-recorded loop played through a low-quality speaker. Regional dispatch logs from that night show no reports of missing persons or emergency signals in the surrounding 30-mile radius. Thorne noted in his journal that the sound appeared to stay at a fixed point despite the swirling wind that should have caused the audio to drift. The following morning, Thorne conducted a physical inspection of the ravine to identify any signs of a human presence or discarded electronic equipment. He found no footprints in the soft mud and no broken vegetation that would indicate someone had navigated the steep slope. The laurel thickets remained undisturbed, and there was no evidence of a campfire or temporary shelter anywhere in the vicinity. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Thorne reported a persistent sensation of being watched from the tree line. He noted that the biometric sensors on his recording equipment had registered several high-frequency spikes during the time the voice was audible. These spikes did not correspond to any known animal vocalizations or mechanical interference typical of the region. Over the next 3 nights, the auditory phenomenon escalated in both volume and complexity, according to the archived testimonies of university staff who later reviewed the tapes. The voice began to mimic other sounds, including the specific metallic rattle of Thorne's own equipment and the low-frequency hum of the cabin generator. Thorne described the experience as an acoustic mirroring where the environment seemed to be learning and reproducing his own daily sounds. He reported that the voice would sometimes originate from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a disorienting surround sound effect. University records show that Thorne requested a temporary suspension of the project on July 15th, citing sleep deprivation and environmental stress. The peak unexplained incident occurred on the final night of Thorne's residence at the high-elevation ridge station. At 2:30 in the morning, the cabin's external security lights were triggered by movement near the generator shed. Thorne looked out and saw a tall, dark shape standing perfectly still at the edge of the light's reach. The shape did not have a defined heat signature according to the thermal sensors, appearing instead as a cold void against the warmer forest background. The voice then spoke from the shed using a tone that was identical to Thorne's own voice as recorded on his field tapes. It recited his most recent log entry word for word, including the coughs and pauses he had made while recording earlier that day. Thorne barricaded the cabin door and remained in the center of the room until the sun rose over the eastern peaks. He reported that the figure did not move for 4 hours, remaining a static silhouette against the laurel thickets. As soon as it was light enough to navigate, Thorne abandoned the station and hiked the 12 miles back to the trailhead. He did not stop to retrieve his personal belongings or the expensive recording equipment left at the cabin. Upon reaching the university field office, he was described as being in a state of shock, with altered perceptions of time and distance. He claimed that the 12-mile hike had felt like it lasted for several days, despite only taking 4 hours according to his watch. A recovery team was sent to the Ridge Station 3 days later to retrieve the university property and investigate Thorne's claims. They found the cabin exactly as Thorne had described, with the door barricaded from the inside. The recording equipment was still functional, but all the audio files from the final 3 days had been replaced with high-amplitude white noise. This noise contained embedded frequencies that caused physical nausea and vertigo in the technicians who attempted to analyze the data. No footprints were found around the generator shed, and the thermal cameras showed no record of the dark shape Thorne had observed. The Forestry Department officially listed the cause of the incident as a localized acoustic anomaly compounded by extreme psychological fatigue. State records from 1995 indicate that the Ridge Station was permanently decommissioned and the cabin was dismantled. The university conducted a private review of the case, but never released a formal explanation for the audio distortions captured on the early tapes. Some local residents in the nearby town claimed that the ridge had a long history of being a dead zone where sounds behaved unnaturally. They spoke of the mountain having a way of swallowing voices and spitting them back out years later in altered forms. These accounts remain unverified by official scientific agencies, yet they persist in the regional folklore of the Appalachian Highlands. The case of Elias Thorne remains a point of contention among researchers of environmental psychology and wilderness phenomena. Some argue that the unique mineral composition of the ridge created a natural recording medium that could play back ambient sounds under specific atmospheric conditions. Others point to the possibility of a rare type of infrasound caused by wind moving through the ravines, which is known to cause hallucinations and extreme dread. Thorne himself never returned to the mountains and transitioned into a career in data analysis that did not require fieldwork. He reportedly maintained that what he heard was not a hallucination, but a physical attempt by the environment to communicate using his own parameters. Archive notes from a county file in 2009 reveal that 2 other hikers reported similar auditory mirroring in the same general area. These reports describe voices calling from the fog using the names of friends who were standing right next to the witnesses. In each instance, the sounds were described as being just slightly off, possessing a metallic or digital quality that felt fundamentally wrong. Park authorities continue to advise hikers to stay on marked trails and to avoid following sounds that deviate from expected wilderness patterns. The phenomenon remains unresolved, existing in the space between documented acoustic anomaly and the enduring mysteries of the Appalachian wilderness. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to draw millions of visitors who seek the beauty of the high ridges and deep valleys. Most experiences are routine and peaceful, characterized by the natural beauty of the American Southeast. However, the records of the Thorne incident serve as a documented reminder that the wilderness can produce sensory experiences that defy standard logic. The ambiguity of the recordings and the lack of physical evidence leave the case open to interpretation by both skeptics and believers. Whether the sounds are the result of rare natural physics or a more unsettling presence remains a matter of ongoing debate in regional archives. Technicians who reviewed the final white noise tapes noted that the sound appeared to pulse with a rhythm that matched a human heartbeat. This detail was excluded from the official university report, but was leaked in a regional newspaper archive from 2001. The pulse was reportedly consistent across all 3 hours of the final recording, even as the volume of the noise fluctuated. This led some investigators to suggest that the recording equipment was not malfunctioning, but was instead capturing a biological signal from an unknown source. These claims were never substantiated by further field studies, as no researchers were willing to occupy the ridge station for extended periods. In the years following the decommissioning of the station, the forest has largely reclaimed the site where the cabin once stood. The pack trail has become overgrown with laurel thickets and is now nearly impossible to follow without specialized GPS equipment. Despite the physical removal of the structures, the ridge remains a focal point for stories of voices in the fog among the local community. Hikers occasionally report hearing their own names called from the ravines, but they are now more likely to ignore the sound than to investigate. The legacy of the Thorn incident persists as a factual record of a time when the mountains appeared to talk back. The psychological impact on the university staff involved in the recovery effort was significant, with several reporting recurring nightmares of being watched. They described a feeling of wrongness that permeated the cabin, as if the air itself had been altered by the events. Official records show that 2 members of the recovery team resigned from their positions shortly after returning from the ridge. They cited personal reasons, but colleagues noted their sudden aversion to high-elevation fieldwork following the assignment. These individual reactions highlight the disturbing nature of an experience that has no physical cause but leaves a lasting sensory imprint. Environmental researchers continue to study the Great Smoky Mountains for their unique acoustic properties and diverse biological signals. The region remains a vital part of the American wilderness, offering insights into the complex interactions between terrain and sound. However, the case of Elias Thorn stands as a unique entry in the archives, representing a moment where the interaction became hostile and unexplained. The missing audio and the conflicting testimonies of time distortion ensure that the incident will remain a topic of interest for years to come. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, and some of them are only heard by those who venture too far into the fog. The final log entry from Thorn's journal, dated July 16, 1994, contains a single sentence written in frantic handwriting. It states that the voice in the ravine was finally correct, sounding exactly like his mother, who had passed away years earlier. This specific detail was never verified by the university, but was included in a first-hand account published in a regional mystery magazine. It adds a layer of personal disturbance to an already unsettling narrative, suggesting that the phenomenon had access to Thorn's own memories. The ambiguity of this claim serves to further muddy the waters between psychological breakdown and an objective external phenomenon. Investigators who attempted to replicate the acoustic spikes years later found that the ridge had returned to a normal baseline. They were unable to capture any white noise or voice mimicry, even during similar atmospheric conditions and thermal inversions. This has led some to believe that the Thorn incident was a one-time event triggered by a specific, unknown combination of variables. Others suggest that the mountain only speaks when it has a specific target to mirror and learn from over time. The lack of recurring data makes it impossible to draw a definitive conclusion, leaving the ridge station's legacy in a state of permanent uncertainty. Thorn's equipment was eventually sold at a state auction, and its current whereabouts are unknown to the university archives. Some believe that the sensors themselves were permanently altered by the high-frequency spikes and the white noise recordings. There is no official evidence to support this, but the story persists in the folklore surrounding the decommissioning of the site. The ridge remains a silent part of the park's vast wilderness, a place where the trees grow tall over the secrets of 1994. The Appalachian wilderness continues to be a place of beauty and deep, unresolved mystery for all who enter. The records of the local historical society continue to be a primary source for those looking to understand the unsettling sounds of the ridge. They contain a collection of first-hand accounts and newspaper archives that span several decades of regional history. Each entry contributes to a larger picture of an environment that does not always follow the expected laws of physics or acoustics. The Thorn incident is just one chapter in a much older narrative of voices that call from the laurel thickets. It remains the best documented case due to the involvement of the university and the recovery of the field journals. Park officials occasionally conduct routine patrols of the area to ensure that no unauthorized camping or structures have been established. These patrols are uneventful, reporting only the presence of local wildlife and the occasional overgrowth of the trails. They do not report hearing voices or experiencing time distortion, suggesting that the phenomenon remains dormant or highly selective. The ridge is now just another coordinate on a map of millions of acres of protected wilderness. However, for those who know the history of the Thorn case, the area remains a place of caution and unsettling memory. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest geological formations on Earth, and their deep valleys have seen centuries of human history. The folklore of the region is rich with stories of spirits, monsters, and unexplained occurrences that date back to the earliest settlers. The Thorn incident is a modern addition to this long tradition, blending technology with the ancient mysteries of the high ridges. It serves as a reminder that even in an age of digital recording and biometric sensors, the wilderness can remain fundamentally unknowable. The fog still rolls over the laurel thickets, and the silence of the forest is still broken by sounds that cannot be explained. The final university report on the project concluded that the Great Smoky Mountains survey was a failure due to unforeseen environmental challenges. It did not mention the voices, the silhouette, or the white noise tapes that caused physical illness in the staff. The official narrative focuses on the logistical difficulties and the lack of useful biological data captured by the stations. This omission has led to accusations of a cover-up among some members of the regional paranormal community. However, without further access to the restricted archives, these claims remain entirely speculative and unsupported by physical evidence. Thorne's later years were spent in relative obscurity, away from the public eye and the academic world of forestry. He reportedly avoided any discussions about his time on the ridge, even with close friends and family members. His journals were donated to the local historical society by his estate after his death in 2018. They remain the primary source for anyone looking to reconstruct the events of that final week in 1994. They are a window into a mind experiencing the impossible and a factual record of a phenomenon that has no name. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park remains a testament to the power of nature and the importance of wilderness preservation. It is a place where millions find peace and connection with the natural world in the American Southeast. But it is also a place that holds records of events that defy the very science we use to study it. The case of the Ridge Station and the mimicked voices is a permanent part of that landscape, recorded in the archives of those who were there. It remains a disturbing, non-criminal incident that continues to intrigue and unsettle those who seek the truth. Final review of the Thorn incident highlights the enduring ambiguity of witness perception in extreme environments. The lack of physical traces like footprints or camera footage of the entity makes it impossible to confirm an external presence. Yet the consistent audio anomalies and the physiological reactions of the staff point toward an objective event of some kind. This tension between the seen and the heard is what defines the most unsettling cases in the Appalachian archives. The mountains continue to stand in silence, keeping their secrets from those who only walk the marked trails. If you hear your name called in the deep ravines of Appalachia, the local folklore suggests you should never answer back. The story of Elias Thorne is a factual reconstruction of why that belief exists in the first place. It is a narrative of a man who listened too closely to the sounds of the mountain and found something that could talk back in his own voice. The ridge remains a silent monument to that experience, a place where the laurel thickets grow over the forgotten history of 1994. The wilderness is vast, and its memories are long and deep. In this news story, at exactly midnight, the bedroom light turned on, no one was home. The reliability of modern home automation systems is often marketed as a foolproof method for maintaining a lived-in appearance while a property is unoccupied. Most homeowners assume that a digital schedule managed via a centralized hub will execute lighting commands with perfect mechanical precision. However, the internal server logs and electrical frequency records from a high-tech residence in suburban Arizona suggest that some activations occur outside the programmed parameters. A routine vacation can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when a remote monitoring app alerts the owner to a physical change in an empty house. Kellen Sterling was a 42-year-old electrical engineer who specialized in smart grid integration for large-scale utility companies in the Phoenix area. He lived in a custom-built, energy-efficient home in the foothills of the McDowell Mountains that he'd outfitted with a proprietary, hardwired automation network. His primary goal for the winter of 2024 was to take a 10-day solo hiking trip through the Grand Canyon while monitoring his home's performance via a secure satellite uplink. Kellen was a man of extreme technical discipline who'd programmed every light, lock, and sensor to follow a strict, randomized schedule to deter any potential burglars. He relied on real-time data and encrypted notifications to maintain a sense of total control over his property from hundreds of miles away. The incident began on a clear Tuesday in the month of November in the year 2024 during a period of intense desert cooling. Kellen was at his campsite when his smartphone received a high-priority notification, indicating that the primary bedroom light had been manually switched on at precisely midnight. He opened his home security app and felt a surge of cold adrenaline as the live interior camera feed showed the room flooded with a bright, steady light. The motion sensors remained inactive, and the smart locks confirmed that no doors or windows had been opened or tampered with since his departure. He zoomed in on the physical wall switch and noticed that the toggle was in the up position, despite the fact that he lived alone and the house was completely empty. The light remained on for exactly 60 minutes before it clicked back into the off position at precisely 1 o'clock in the morning. Kellen used his remote access to pull the electrical consumption logs and found a massive, localized power surge that had occurred at the exact moment of the activation. He checked the diagnostic history of the Smart Hub and discovered that the system had recorded no command, digital or manual, to trigger the bedroom circuit. The footage from the previous 6 hours showed the room in total darkness, with no shadows or movement that would suggest a physical intruder was present. He stayed awake in his tent, repeatedly refreshing the camera feed, but the room remained silent and dark for the rest of the night. The next morning, Kellen began a step-by-step investigation of his home's network by reviewing the manufacturer's firmware logs and the archived notes from the original electrical contractor. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every circuit load and signal interference pattern that had occurred since the house was built in 2015. He discovered that the master bedroom was situated directly above a decommissioned utility vault that had been sealed during the early 1990s. According to a county file from 2009, the vault had housed a series of experimental high-voltage transformers used for testing regional power grid resilience. The archives indicated that a senior technician had died from an accidental discharge at that exact location during a midnight maintenance check in 1992. He searched the digital archives of the local utility company and found a series of recordings from the original site supervisors regarding unexplainable phantom loads on the circuit. These files described a man named Silas Thorne, who was known for his obsessive punctuality and his habit of manually testing switches at the top of every hour. Silas had reportedly been found slumped against the primary control panel, his hand still gripping the main toggle that managed the lighting for the facility's upper level. The witness statements from the original state records mentioned that the vault continued to hum with residual energy for years after the power was officially cut. Kellen realized that the structural alignment of his bedroom floor and the vault's ceiling created a perfect path for electromagnetic induction. The high-definition footage was reviewed by a systems analyst who found that the light didn't just turn on, but appeared to reach full intensity instantly, bypassing the smart dimmer's soft start feature. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a physical intruder on the property, as the exterior perimeter sensors showed no disturbances in the gravel landscaping. Records conflict regarding the exact nature of the midnight surge, with some engineers claiming it was a static discharge event caused by the dry desert air and the proximity to the old vault. Kellen decided to install a series of heavy-duty grounding plates beneath his bedroom floorboards and continued to monitor the midnight logs for any signs of recurring activity. He kept the original one-hour recording on a secure, encrypted drive as a record of the night that his smart home was overridden by a legacy signal. The property remains under constant observation today as Kellen continues his work with a new focus on the lingering electrical echoes of decommissioned industrial sites. He still reviews the midnight footage occasionally, but he remains unable to find a software glitch or a mechanical failure in the smart switch or the hub. The final report is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple technical explanation in the age of digital automation. He sleeps with a manual override switch now because he knows that some circuits don't need a user ID to be activated by the past. Some locations carry an electrical memory that is recorded in the very wiring of the walls and the surrounding earth. The engineering community still discusses the Kellen Sterling incident as an example of potential ghost switching in high-density residential zones built over industrial infrastructure. However, Kellen knows that what his sensors captured was not a hardware error, but a factual record of a routine that was older than his house. He spends his time now researching the intersection of historical power grids and the modern smart devices that are built on top of the forgotten vaults of the past. The house stands as a silent witness to the technician who was still trying to complete his midnight rounds decades after the facility was closed. He closes his laptop and turns off the office light with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the signals in the dark. The final entry in the county file regarding the death of the technician noted that he was a man of immense technical pride and a terrifyingly focused sense of responsibility. This detail suggests that the presence Kellen detected was not a malicious hack, but an echo of an obligation that had been repeated for a lifetime. It suggests that the bedroom floor was acting as a storage medium for the final mechanical actions of a man who refused to leave his post during the blackout. Kellen believes that the midnight surge was a bridge between the old grid and the new that allowed a forgotten duty to be seen one last time. The light in the bedroom was merely a reminder that the energy we put into our work can linger long after the switch has been turned off. The quiet foothills of Arizona rarely make the national news for anything other than routine property development reports and standard seasonal tourism updates. Yet, underneath the surface of the modern desert homes, there are stories that remain recorded in the deep, unindexed layers of the local utility archives. Kellen Sterling is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive for future study. He continues to document every voltage spike with the same professional objectivity because he knows that the truth is often found in the things that shouldn't have power. The reality of the midnight light is a mystery that requires us to acknowledge the things that we cannot simply explain away with a remote reset. The study of the property's electromagnetic and grounding resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under restricted access. No further midnight activations have been reported by Kellen, as the home's grounding system was updated to isolate the bedroom circuit from the vault below. The memory of the light turning on in an empty house remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that desert sanctuary. Kellen has moved on with his career, but he never forgets to check the midnight logs every single morning when he first logs into his server. He knows that the past is always looking for a way to leave a digital signature on the technology and the lives of the future. The legacy of the technician is now a part of the local lore that the electrical workers discuss in their private radio channels during the long night shifts. They talk about the man who died at his post and the engineer who found the pulse of a ghost on his monitoring tablet. For Kellen, it isn't a story for a dinner party, but a technical record of a night that changed his understanding of what it means to be truly secure. He continues to design his smart grid protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a reliable and private environment for his family. The hubs are only the beginning of the observation of a world that we're still learning to measure in the darkness. The final report on the property noted that the vault had experienced a localized phenomenon known as resonant coupling due to the unique layout of the bedroom's copper wiring. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the electrical anomalies that Kellen had originally sought to quantify with his professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a natural antenna for the static charge of the Earth and the forgotten transformers that once stood in the valley below. Kellen looks at the mountain ridge and wonders how many other people are being signaled by the stories of those who built the frontier's power. He understands now that the most important data is often the kind that requires a midnight watch to even believe. The house remains a dark silhouette against the Arizona skyline while the engineer continues to search for the patterns in the encrypted logs. Kellen Sterling keeps his focus on the grid, but he's always watching for the light of a man who doesn't belong to the living world anymore. He knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right moment to be seen by an objective and technical observer. The silence of the desert is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everything that happened before he arrived. He sleeps soundly now, knowing that the Watchman has finally been documented and found his way back into the digital archives of the past.